Okay, so as Lydia mentioned and forecasted, Chris Shepard with the Nature Conservancy is giving our third talk of the day, the 9th agenda item, and that's valuing the flood risk reduction benefits of Florida's mangroves.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure can, Chris. Hi there.
Okay.
Let me talk. So the purpose of Chris's talk is to present TNC's most recent work to better understand the value of mangrove habitat to help reduce flood risk. And the connection with the comprehensive plan supports all hydrological restoration CCMP actions and activities. Chris, real quick question. Was like last week or the week before Mangrove Week, International Mangrove Week?
I think there was a day, yeah.
Or a day. Okay, so we're not too far from that. Great.
Yeah.
I'll give it to you. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So I just wanted to say hello before I turn my video off. I have some connectivity issues sometimes at this time of day, so I wanted you to be able to see my face, but during the PowerPoint, I'm gonna turn that off. So my name's Chris Shepard. I'm Director of Science for TNC's Gulf of Mexico program. We work across the 5 Gulf states, both internally with our TNC chapters and externally with a variety of partners, ranging from local governments to state and federal agencies and communities across those 5 states. I'm actually based in Florida. Currently, I'm living within the estuary. I'm in Punta Gorda for the summer. And I'm going to be presenting to you on some work that we finished up at the end of 2019, but has since been leading to some additional mangrove work that we have in the pipeline. So I'll be sharing some of that with you as well. So let me go ahead and hit this video in case there's any problems. All right, next slide, please. So when we talk about the role of nature in coastal resilience or in adapting to climate change, we're really focusing on coastal habitats. This is the list of the coastal habitats that TNC has really focused on in terms of nature-based solutions and adapting to climate change, and really trying to understand the role that they can play, the magnitude of the role that these coastal habitats can play. So over the past 15 years or so, we've worked pretty hard to collate some of the science and develop new science in partnership with a bunch of other academics and governmental scientists to really understand how nature can help protect people, protect economies, and support coastal communities with respect to reducing flood risk and adapting to climate change. So we've put out papers that touch each of these different types of habitats, and in some cases kind of complexes of multiple habitats, and how they can kind of work together to provide these coastal protection benefits. Next slide, please. So the idea of the role of nature playing a role in reducing risk and stabilizing shorelines really came about in the popular press after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005 and Hurricane Katrina. And so at that time, coastal habitat restoration and protection of coastal habitats really was mostly done for strictly conservation benefits. But after those 2 major significant events, the global media and the popular press really started to tout the benefits of natural habitats and the role that they may have played in those disasters. So in Hurricane Katrina, you saw a lot of articles talking about the role of marshes and how there was so much marsh loss in Louisiana, and that contributed to the outcomes from Hurricane Katrina. And then for the Indian Ocean tsunami, there were anecdotal stories about communities that were behind mangroves suffering less damage, and communities that had their mangroves removed for timber, seeing increased benefits and more damage and more deaths from the tsunami. And so at the time, a lot of folks within the Nature Conservancy and some other NGOs and folks within NOAA really started to think about, well, wait a minute, maybe there is a there, and we should start looking into this. And so I was in graduate school at the time and did a review paper on the role of salt marshes in stabilizing shorelines, and found that there was enough data to suggest that salt marshes can play a significant role by doing the things listed here: storing water, attenuating or reducing the waves, decreasing erosion. And since that time, 15 years ago, the body of evidence has increased to the point where these types of approaches are implemented all across the world. And just the knowledge basis about the role of nature in reducing risk is just expanded by quite a bit. Next slide, please. So at the Nature Conservancy, we have an interest in the role that nature can play in reducing risk, because our vision is that all over the world, nature-based solutions are protecting and supporting people, communities, and economies. And that when communities are considering how to manage their shorelines, how to manage their watersheds, they're really thinking holistically about a whole suite of options, ranging from more traditional total gray infrastructure approaches to more hybrid living shoreline types of approaches, how they're thinking about their land use and leaving some areas undeveloped, and all the way over to coastal restoration and protection of coastal habitats. Slide. So within TNC, a lot of this work kind of falls under an umbrella program called Coastal Resilience. The Coastal Resilience program focuses on developing and finding and putting out into the public as much science as we can about the role of nature in reducing risk, and working with engineering firms in partnership with engineering firms who are thinking and developing these innovative nature-based approaches. So you can see here, I have a picture from a study we put out a few years ago looking at the role of salt marshes during Hurricane Sandy. That was with many of the authors that I'll be presenting on the study today, many of the same folks who worked on that same project. And we found that salt marshes reduced property damage during Hurricane Sandy by $625 million. Which is a significant figure for an area that actually doesn't have a whole lot of salt marshes left compared to the historic distribution of salt marshes. And then so for today, I'm going to be focusing on the Hurricane Irma and Collier County mangrove assessment that we did, that we put out last year. Next slide, please. Some folks that I know quite a few people on this phone call today, and I think a few of you have actually seen this presentation, but many folks, when they think of coastal resilience, they're thinking of the decision support tool that TNC developed with a whole bunch of partners. There is a Gulf of Mexico version of this decision support tool, and you can see on the left these gray squares with the little icons on them. Each of those boxes is an app, similar to an app that you would use on your phone. And when you click on each app, there is information and an interactive user interface that helps you think about different aspects of planning and implementing nature-based solutions. So there's a Risk Explorer app that helps you get a snapshot of where habitats are likely to reduce risk and likely are already providing those benefits to coastal communities. There's a future habitat app that gives you a sense of what the habitats are likely to look like with future sea level rise, provided they actually have space to migrate into. So there's a whole bunch of different apps on the Coastal Resilience tool. And we tend to take the science that we develop and put it on the Coastal Resilience tool so it can be used for regional and community planning across the 5 Gulf states. Next slide, please. The most important part of the Coastal Resilience program is the network of folks. So it's a network of TNC practitioners across North America and across the globe, and also the connections to all of our partners in the communities in which we work. And so the network is our strongest resource in that we can share monitoring data from these types of projects. We can share new science. We can share decision support tools. So if one decision support tool or app is developed in one geography, we can pick it up and plug it in somewhere else with local data. So the real strength of this work is in the network of people. Many of the folks that are involved in the Coastal Resilience Network are external to TNC from NEPs across North America. Some of the folks on the call today partners that we've worked on a variety of projects to date as well. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of summarizes the coastal resilience body of work. There's a kind of 4-step framework, and the science and the projects kind of all touch down at different points throughout the process, but it really is about assessing risk, so understanding what level of risk the community or the region is facing, and identifying where nature-based solutions might be appropriate. Taking action, which is investing in a solution on the ground, and then measuring effectiveness. And so the most important thing here is to kind of measure the effectiveness of nature-based solutions, so then it can then go back and inform on, well, actually, has there been a reduction in risk? So what are the benefits we're seeing from these projects? So a lot of the science that we've been focusing on the last 5 to 7 years is really on that. How effective are nature-based solutions? How do we measure that on a project scale? How do we measure that on like a regional habitat scale? And so this slide is a couple years old, but this type of thinking and these types of results and engagement has taken place all over the world. And we really learn as we go. We learn from partners, as the previous or discussion you were talking about Tampa Bay. We really try to learn as we go to adapt and improve as we develop and try to implement nature-based solutions at a variety of different scales. Next slide, please. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, this is the kinds of examples of projects that we're talking about. There's a whole array of projects that could be considered nature-based solutions, but when we're thinking about projects that reduce risk, we're thinking about reducing risk to other habitats. We're thinking about reducing risk to communities, so people that are living along the coast or in a coastal watershed. Other examples include hybrid nature-based solutions, so a more engineered type of living shoreline. Protecting land from development, so just pure conservation of open space. So there are ways to strategically do that to reduce flood risk. And then watershed-based restoration, and really just watershed-based decision-making. So thinking about the whole watershed when you're thinking about nature-based solutions, not necessarily focusing exclusively on the shoreline, but really what are all the nature-based components that we can invest in as far as nature-based solutions to make the entire community and the watershed more resilient to future impacts from storms and climate change. Next slide, please. I always include this slide because it's a really critical statement and a visual, and that's to say that reducing risk and increasing resilience really involves multiple solutions. There are investments to benefit social resilience and economic resilience, but when we're talking about risk reduction, nature is definitely not a magic bullet. I think when nature-based solutions first came on the scene, people were like, wow, we can put living shorelines everywhere and everything will be grand. We kind of learned right away that that's not the case, and that these solutions have to be tailored and adapted to local conditions and be kind of part of a more comprehensive hazard mitigation plan. So all types of different solutions need to be involved here. In some cases, the risk is just too high and it just needs to be insured. Development plays a role here. In some places, a more traditional seawall is definitely called for. So we're not saying that nature-based solutions are the cure-all. We're just advocating that they definitely be on the item list, the menu of options available when we're thinking about building resilience. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show a quick screenshot of the Risk Explorer from the Gulf of Mexico. The key takeaway here is that the green areas on a Gulf-wide scale are areas that currently have habitats that are located in areas where they're likely providing a coastal resilience benefit to communities. So all of the NEP shorelines here kind of highlight the potential that this region has for nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So you can see all the green along this area, and then also for the Risk Explorer for the Gulf of Mexico version, we also added in an additional layer that's shown in blue, which is areas of high suitability for oyster restoration. So we did sort of a future scenario of, well, what if you did high levels of oyster restoration within the highly suitable areas across the Gulf of Mexico, which areas sort of light up on the map as being areas where oyster restoration would be a really good strategy for increasing resilience. And Charlotte Harbor definitely was one of the key areas that came up when we looked across the whole system scale across the entire Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. And as a result of that, a few years ago, TNC and CHNEP and other partners developed an oyster reef project, the True Oyster Reef project, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I love this project because I was living in Punta Gorda at the time, and a lot of my friends were involved in helping to work with some of the materials. Our kids were involved. It was just a really great example of a community-based project. But really the science and thinking about nature-based solutions across a Gulf-wide scale drove us towards identifying and implementing a project in this particular estuary. So I still think there's a lot of opportunity for nature-based solutions in Charlotte Harbor in particular. Next slide, please. Oh, that's just a picture of the project for those who aren't familiar with it, but I think most people are. Next slide. All right, so that brings us to mangroves. So mangroves was a bit of a kind of next step for us. We had thought quite a bit about living shorelines and the role of oysters and where it's suitable to do a more shellfish-based or oyster-based living shoreline across the Gulf of Mexico, and have worked on a bunch of those types of projects across the 5 Gulf states. And we had experience working with RMS risk management solutions to think about how to model and measure the benefits of coastal wetlands, because we had worked on the Hurricane Sandy study with them and evaluated the role of salt marsh in that region. And so after Hurricane Irma, we put a proposal together for some private money from the Walton Family Foundation to work with RMS and some scientists at UC Santa Cruz to try and figure out, well, what was the benefit of mangroves? Anecdotally, a lot of folks say, yes, they feel like they're protected by mangroves, but really getting to the dollars and cents of the matter just makes the information more accessible to some folks that maybe don't necessarily, mangrove extent and abundance is not a high priority for them, but thinking about it from a risk reduction lens kind of gets the bell ringing, gets their attention. Next slide, please. So for this particular study, we had 2 different questions. The first was, how and where does mangrove presence affect flood extent? So kind of the footprint of the flooding and the height of from storm surge. And then also, how and where does that, the impact of the mangroves on the footprint of the storm surge, how does that translate into a benefit for people and property? So how do we take the extent of flooding and the changes that mangrove cause in the extent of flooding and translate that into benefits for coastal communities? Next slide, please. So when we were developing the study, we were very fortunate to have the participation, partnership, and collaboration of Risk Management Solutions. They provide data and loss estimate information to global insurers and reinsurers. They're one of the leading risk modeling companies in the world. And so we had access to using their actual catastrophe models to take a look at mangroves in Florida. And so using their catastrophe models, we were able to model the extent of flooding from Hurricane Irma, and also to translate that into the economic benefits of mangroves. And so we took 2 different approaches kind of based on the timing and the funding that we had. The first one was we looked at all of the Hurricane Irma impacted counties in Florida, and we modeled the storm surge from Irma both with and without mangroves. So when you have the flood, when you do the hydrodynamic modeling, using the catastrophe model from RMS, they have mangroves accounted for within their models. And they are accounted for with a friction coefficient. And so we ran the models in a current as-is scenario, and then we deleted all of the mangroves from their grid and ran the models again. So the difference between those two scenarios gets us the difference between the storm surge envelope, and then we can take that difference in the envelope and calculate the difference as far as economic impact. So that was the first thing that we did. The second thing that we did was we looked at annual flood damages in Collier County over 100 modeled storms that are representative of the typical types of storms. And it's based on historic storms to Collier County, because we wanted to get an idea of kind of what an annual benefit is on a county scale from mangroves. So we looked at Collier in particular because of the extent of mangroves in Collier County, and also because of the benefits that we thought we were likely to see from Hurricane Irma. Next slide, please. So the first of the results that I'll share here, and all of this is available in a PDF report that I can share with you all, and we can send it out to the group. The first part of the study was looking at the mangrove benefits during Hurricane Irma. So this is all of Southwest and Southeast Florida that was impacted by Hurricane Irma in 2017. And we found that when we compared the storm surge with the mangroves and without the mangroves, that mangroves averted $1.5 billion in property damages. So billion. So that's a significant figure that immediately got our attention and gets the attention of others, that as we're seeing increasing storms and increasing intensity of storms, we really need to think critically about the existing mangroves, which are only a fraction of the level that they historically were. We also found, for looking across all of the counties that had mangroves, that those mangroves likely reduced that damage by 25%. So it would have been 25% higher if those mangroves weren't there. So, that makes you think long and hard about, mangrove destruction, which a lot of folks think doesn't take place. And I had an interesting experience when we posted these results on the Nature Conservancies of Florida. They posted it on their Facebook, and so many of the comments were sort of like, duh. We know that mangroves are helpful, and also mangroves are protected. So why are you doing this study? But actually, it's still not too complicated for folks to get permits to remove them. And so, we just think it's a critical resource for the state of Florida. And we're focusing more and more of our effort on this, especially since we saw the results of this study. Now, that being said, the benefits from mangroves are not consistently a positive benefit across the board. There are areas in which the proximity and the location of a home with respect to the mangroves puts it at increased flooding risk because of that. And that's mostly in areas where the homes are located in front of the mangroves, so they can't provide a buffer. It's where a development has been allowed in front of the mangroves or directly within them. Where we see this, you can kind of see on this map here some of this yellow, orange, and red, some of these areas where, if you're in front of the mangroves or kind of in a U shape with them around you, you're not really going to see that benefit. The benefit is if you're kind of behind a larger swath of mangroves. So for the Hurricane Irma analysis, we saw most of the benefit in more dense urban corridors that are behind larger extents of mangrove forest. Next slide, please. Within the report, you can see the estimates per hectare at the county scale and kind of how that varies. And I'm not sure exactly what scale the data is available, but we have had some data requests, and I can help with that if that's something that folks are interested in. Kind of looking at more fine scale information for particular areas of concern. And just to even help use this information when development permits are being considered or for any kind of local decision making. We got the data as granular as we could for this particular analysis, but we are interested in kind of making it available if it can be used to support decision making as much as we can. Next slide, please. When you take a look at the Irma benefits, it's important to also consider the benefits to people. So when you think about population density, you can see how many people, so more than 500,000 people benefited from mangroves during Hurricane Irma. That's a lot of people. Now, that being said, as I mentioned, it's not a consistent positive benefit across the board. There are some locations where high population densities are at increased risk because of where development was allowed. And you can kind of see that from the results of this study. Next slide, please. So I mentioned there were kind of two prongs to this study. The first one was looking across Hurricane Irma and looking at where mangroves provided benefit across Southeast and Southwest Florida. But we also wanted to take a closer look at the county scale. We focused on Collier County to try and understand, across a whole suite of storms. So, with a risk profile that was generated based off the historic storms that have impacted this region, we want to understand, what kind of benefit is that annually to Collier County in particular. And so when you look at the avoided damages when we're modeling those 100 storms, so for each of those 100 storms, we modeled the flood surge extent and height for each of those, and then we ran it again without the mangroves and calculated the difference. So this value comes from the average of those 100 simulations. You can see that for the properties that are located behind the mangroves, there's a 25% or 0.5% savings to properties in Collier County. So a tremendous benefit there. That's all coming from nature, from natural infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, when you add in all of the properties here, not just those that are behind the mangroves, that's where you can start to see those very coastal, kind of located in front of the mangroves, coastal properties, that we're likely to see increased flooding due to the presence of the mangroves, due to the location where that development takes place. Next slide, please. So we put together this little infographic. It's pretty simple, but just to kind of communicate that the surge level is reduced behind the mangroves and that water kind of builds up in front of those mangroves. So when you're thinking about allowing removal of a mangrove, or even thinking about where to revegetate to provide these benefits in the future, it's super important to consider the orientation and the extent, the proximity to the coastline, the orientation of the coastline, because not all of these situations are the same. And we're seeing from this, as well as from some other studies that I've seen recently, that allowing that development to take place in front of those mangroves or directly within them is just incredibly risky and increases the risk profile for the community. Next slide, please. So in summary, this study for us was super important because we developed this work in partnership with Risk Management Solutions using their own insurance industry models. So these are the actual models that they run simulations and then sell the outputs to insurers and reinsurers all over the world. And so our initial conversation to them was sort of like, hey, do your models account for coastal habitats? And they said, well, yes. And so then we started down the conversation of, well, how do we measure the benefit of mangroves? We found that, there's significant benefits from mangroves, both on an annual instance and also just on a per storm basis. And every hectare of mangroves with properties behind them on average provided almost $8,000 in risk reduction benefits during Hurricane Irma. So these are real significant, economic outputs, findings that we think are important to consider for any kind of decision making surrounding the removal or destruction of existing mangroves, and also thinking about where to focus on mangrove restoration, and also the future of mangroves with sea level rise. Next slide, please. That's the. I mentioned earlier that we have some kind of new work coming online related to mangroves and kind of partially stemming from this project. One of them is I'm a co-PI on another National Academies project, similar, it's the same funding source for the GEMS project that Northeastern University is leading in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and USGS, and that's looking at mangrove migration with climate change along the Gulf of Mexico, and where that migration is likely to be impacted by people. So people as in coastal landowners, property owners, and also coastal managers and agencies, because in some places like Florida, mangroves are protected. So if they migrate into a new area, they're already protected. And in other parts of the Gulf of Mexico, as they migrate, that can either be facilitated, as it is in some parts of Texas and in some parts of Louisiana, where they're proactively trying to facilitate migration. And then also there are some instances where people view them as a nuisance, impeding on the marsh, and they're removing them as soon as they see them. And so the goal of that project is for us to try to get a handle on what that looks like in the future, and how policies and kind of human behavior will likely impact the migration of mangroves across the Gulf of Mexico. Internally at the Nature Conservancy, we're thinking a lot more about focusing our conservation efforts on upland migration corridors of mangroves, and that if we don't do that now and really think strongly about where mangroves are likely to be in the future, they probably won't be there. And then finally, we have a grant pending with a private funder to think about how you would develop an insurance product for mangroves. TNC led an effort to develop an insurance product for coral reefs in Mexico. And so we're trying to do kind of like a pre-feasibility assessment on what would it take to insure mangroves, what would that product look like, when would it pay out, what would it pay for, would municipalities be interested in purchasing it, or coastal property owners. And an additional component of that project, which we don't have funded yet, but we're hoping we will, is to think about how would you do a mangrove project if you were trying to set it up for coastal protection benefits right away. And I know in the past we've had a bunch of conversations and planning related to a potential mangrove project at the Tiki Point project at the Sheraton location, and I think that's a good example of trying to be forward thinking about how to develop a mangrove project that can provide some resilience benefits right away. So not just thinking about hydrologic alterations or planting seedlings, but kind of scaling something up rather quickly, either using larger, more mature mangroves, or more of a hybrid approach that uses multiple habitats and some concrete in there. So with that, I think mangroves are super important in Florida, super important within your estuary, and I appreciate the opportunity to present this work with you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So any questions for Dr. Shepard, the TNC? Oh, I see one from Mindy. I'll read it here. It would be interesting to see how the width of the mangrove habitat and height of mangroves in front of residential housing makes a difference in storm surge impacts.
Yes, that is a great point. We are preparing this study for a manuscript submission, and we are trying to see what we can pull out as far as a table related to width. So that's a good point. I think you mentioned height also. I don't think we don't have the ability to comment on that from this particular study, because it was just based on the two-dimensional kind of extent of mangroves that we had within the grid. But I know that that's something that other folks are looking at quite strongly. And even from Irma, I just reviewed a paper that was looking at Irma, and they did some amazing remotely sensed data monitoring to look at the height changes in the canopy, and all of that will play a role for sure in the flood mitigation benefits. So I think the only one that I think we can capture for this one is extent, but I still think just in a tabular form, even if it's average extents, would be helpful. So that's a good point, Mindy.
This is Jennifer. I don't have the ability to raise my hand, but I'm going to do it on camera here. I just had a couple, one comment, a couple questions. One was that I don't know, Chris, if you've had a chance, again, to kind of revisit the mangrove heart attack study that my predecessor, Dr. Beaver, had done, looking at mangroves and where they're stressing for a variety of reasons, and where they're likely to be stressed, and kind of connecting that to what you're doing here to talk about the importance of restoration and trying to strategically allocate resources to those areas that are very vulnerable, but also very important from your study economically. So I was wondering if you had had a chance to look at that, or were planning to do that, but I wanted to suggest that if you hadn't.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. And I wonder if we could kind of overlay that with our results to see if there's any sort of pattern there. Do you know if that exists in like a shapefile format of the location?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we have it in our GIS server, so we could like try to pull that out and package it up and send it to you. But I think that GIS analysis would be very interesting. I'd love to see how these two things intersect.
Yeah,
leverage our work with your work. And then I just wondered if you, I think I understand you said about avoided damages over and over again about, like, is that, I would assume from protecting existing development, but it's not from the fact that those things have not been converted. It's not avoided losses because those areas are mangroves rather than development, correct?
Correct. So it's actually looking at the extent and the height of the storm surge, and then there are damage curves for each kind of residential, each kind of structure, of how the water level will affect the economic damage, or and so that is calculated for each of those scenarios. So it's the actual difference in the damage to the existing structures.
Okay, so it is about protecting existing development behind the mangroves.
Yeah.
I just wanted that clarification. And then also just I didn't know if you could elaborate, when you talked about those areas where that could negatively affect people. Could you elaborate a little bit more, like how that would happen, that those areas would be negatively affecting people rather than property? I think you had a couple slides back, a graphic about that, and I was curious what exactly it would do that would negatively affect those people.
Okay, so that is more about, it's still connected to their structures, but it's kind of removing the element of the value of those structures. Does that make sense? So it's the number of people whose homes are impacted, but it's removing it's kind of focusing more on population density, as opposed to, like, in certain neighborhoods where the properties are worth a lot more money, the damages would be higher. Does that make sense?
Is it like the people are being displaced? So like the number of people who potentially would have to suffer like damage. So it's not the value of the property damage, but the fact that their property was damaged affected them.
Yes.
They may have had to move in with a friend, or
right. Exactly.
because a repairman had to come or something like that.
Right. Yeah, because one of the issues with looking at it in this way is that you're going to see it's hard to control for the property values, right? So you could be having let's say 5,000 housing units damaged in a lower socioeconomic area and have 500 housing units damaged in a higher socioeconomic area. And when you look at it from what's the damage to the homes, it's just going to kind of highlight those more affluent areas. So by looking at
I see that in your map because you can see the areas closest to the coast. I mean, it's hard for people, I think, who are outside the Naples area who may not be familiar with like the development patterns there. But when you were looking at that Naples map that you projected, I mean, you're thinking, okay, well, the people closest to the coast suffer more property damage. Well, yeah, that's intuitive, but it's also kind of accentuated by the fact that in Naples you have, multi-million dollars on, one block away from homes that are worth half or a quarter of that.
Yes.
Price because they're not on the water. So I think like for people who are not I think it accentuates it beyond what you would intuitively expect anyway. But if you aren't familiar with the development patterns in that specific area, you may not know that.
That's exactly right. And then when we did the study for salt marshes in New Jersey, the preferred approach was to try and find areas that had salt marsh right next to no salt marsh, and then salt marsh, no salt marsh. So you could have these replicates of with and without salt marsh. And then for that one, we did almost like a fake grid of uniform homes on the landscape. So then when we flooded it with the sandy flooding, we were able to kind of control for property value. We actually tried to do that at first with this project, but we could not find locations that had mangrove, no mangrove, mangrove, no mangrove, with a similar kind of orientation to the coast and elevation. And we had to change our whole approach. So that is kind of one important point that you just brought up, is that the property values are not controlled for. So it's still showing the difference between with and without mangroves, but for affluent neighborhoods with high property homes, that change is still going to be higher.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear that you guys consider that and are going to highlight somewhere in the report, because I think that's something important for the readers that are outside our area. Nicole just put something in the chat box, which Justin, I think is a really good point, which is this mangrove pinch-out effect is also explored in the HRN project report, and there's GIS files there that might be able to be utilized to do some interesting analysis connecting that to your work. Chris.
Yeah, and I can connect with Nicole offline about kind of what the data is and what the extent of it is, because I do think all of that, and even just kind of, if you got me thinking about having an image in the discussion of the paper, because we're just writing the paper now about distribution of property values and how that affects how you interpret the results. So we should talk about that.
Yeah, Chris, we just did a more local version of a SLAM model in this area, and it's a little bit more sophisticated, but I know you all have a pretty good SLAM model for the whole coast, so it's just a little more granular, Yeah,
that's good.
Is what we're talking about, and the result. Yeah, the results are available via a shapefile.
Awesome.
There are a few other comments here. I'll read out loud here. One from let's see, Mark Sramick. His question is: are all three mangrove species, red, white, black, equally resilient in coastal storm protection, or are they considered collectively?
That is a good question. I don't know that it's been quantified to the extent that it's broken down by species. And in this particular study, it was just a shapefile of mangrove extent, and it was all three. So it was not, we didn't break it down further than that, just for the scale of what we were looking at.
Okay, thanks. Can I have a follow-up question on that one? When you when you removed the mangroves to do the willingness to avoid sort of analysis, and you removed the roughness associated with the mangroves, what did you replace it with?
I believe it's just, oh, actually, that's a good question. I don't remember if it turned to open water or if it was just bare land. I think it was just bare land.
So without any roughness? Okay.
Right, yep.
Okay.
And I actually didn't do the modeling, to be fair.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's just a question. I was kind of wondering, what with the way things migrate. So let's see, Amanda. I mean, I'll see if I can do it, but she says very interesting with the exclamation point. Thanks for that informative presentation. Greatly appreciate that you're willing to share the study report PDF. So thanks for that. And again, thank you to Dr. Shepard. So are there any other questions from the floor?
Great, thank you. And I can send the PDF to Nicole, and maybe she can distribute that.
Great. I'll go ahead and put that on the TAC website with the PowerPoint presentations following today's meeting. And by tomorrow, if everyone wants to go on the TAC page, hopefully they'll all be uploaded and ready for viewing by that point. But thank you very much, Dr. Shepard. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Take care.
Yeah. Bye now.